Hey there everyone, welcome to Tales and Text and I'm your host Nisha and welcome to the much awaited review of the volume 8 of the critical edition of the Mahabharata. That's right, I have finally finished reading volume 8 of the BORI Critical Edition of the Mahabharata. It was a behemoth 710 page book and finally after 7 whole months I am done with this book. But before I get into the review, I want to just take a moment to thank all of you for your patience and your patronage. All of you have been so kind as to so patiently wait for this review. And I really, truly appreciate the support and the patience that you have shown me and my channel, Tales and Text. So thank you so much. Just thank you. I really appreciate this. And so yeah, I will continue bringing out more reviews on the Mahabharata, on the Puranas and everything else as I go ahead and I read them and as I explore them. So just want to take a moment to thank you for your patience and your patronage over the span of these 7 months as I read this massive book. So yeah, let's dive right into this review. So get something to eat, get something to drink, get cozy, and let's dive right into the volume 8 review of the BORI Critical Edition of the Mahabharata. We left volume 7 of the BORI Critical Edition of the Mahabharata after the encounter between, or the final showdown between the Pandavas and Duryodhana. Duryodhana is left battered and near death. Bhima uses adharma to bring him down. And the entire situation in volume 7, at the end of volume 7, is one of despair and one of horror at the ways in which both groups, both armies broke the rules of war, the dharma of war, in order to achieve their end goal. So the victory, although hard won, is in the eyes of Yudhishthira especially, who is supposed to be the king, a dirty victory. A victory that he did not want, or it's not the kind of victory that he wanted. So we leave volume 7 ending with a I would say a tone of despair and a tone of foreboding for what is to come. And volume 8 starts out right after that. As usual, we start out with the sutta describing to a king the story. We start, of course, with a brief and a conversation between Vaishampayana and Janamejaya, and then we go right into the conversation between Sanjaya and Dhritarashtra, where Sanjaya tells Dhritarashtra that Duryodhana has finally fallen, and while he's on the verge of death, he's not dead yet, but for all accounts and purposes, Dhritarashtra and Gandhari have lost all 100 of their sons. So with the exception of Dushala, their one daughter, all of their other children are dead. So Dhritarashtra is heartbroken, Gandhari is heartbroken, and we then switch to Dhritarashtra asking, what about the rest of the army? What did they do while Duryodhana lay dying? And that is when Sanjaya recounts what happened right after the encounter, the final showdown between the Pandavas and Duryodhana. So we switch right into the time of the war, and this is once again we're the thick of things. Like I said, the air is full of despair and foreboding, and we go right into the mind of Ashwatthama. Ashwatthama is in a frenzied state. Ashwatthama cannot think clearly, and Ashwatthama, frankly, is incredibly dangerous right now. The way Ashwatthama behaves is I would say, I think the most frightening thing of all during all of the 18 days of the war, I think the way his reaction to Duryodhana's downfall, his reaction to his father's death, and his own reaction to, I would say, a wound to his ego that I am on the losing side, is on the extreme side of things, you could say. So Ashwatthama is at the stage where he's thinking, what next? What do I do next? At this point, the Kuru army, the Kaurava army is completely scattered, and what the reader knows is that only Ashwatthama, Kritavarma and Kripa are the only 3 people who are still alive from the Kaurava army, and nobody else is. While Kripa and Kritavarma have called it, I would say, quits, and I have taken their losses in their stride and have gone away to rest far away from Kurukshetra. I would say not exactly very far away, but close enough to be, to know what's going on, but still not within the thick of the war. For all intents and purposes, they have given up the war and they've exited the arena. But Ashwatthama is determined to do what he feels is show his last act of loyalty towards Duryodhana, because Duryodhana is his best friend, and it is because of Duryodhana's court that his father and he himself have received this position of privilege. And he knows that he cannot defeat the Pandavas in a fair fight. So that is why he starts thinking of unfair means to sort of attack them. And that's when he notices how how a bird comes and attacks another bird in the middle of the night, and while the other bird is sleeping, and slaughters it. And that gives him the idea that if I were to go and attack the sleeping Pandava camp now, I can easily kill most of their warriors and I can run away before I'm caught. So that way I can wreak as much havoc as possible and they won't suspect me, because what is one of the cardinal rules of war? That once the sun has set, the enemies must not attack each other, especially if one enemy has already laid down their arms, which the Pandava camp has already done. So, volume 8 starts out with Ashwatthama plotting this, and he goes and tells Kripa and Kritavarma, and he asks them, come with me, help me in this process, help me in going and attacking the Pandava camp while they're asleep. Kritavarma is horrified, but he doesn't know what to say. Kripa, on the other hand, is, I would say, he tries to speak some sense to Ashwatthama, because Ashwatthama is not only his junior, but he's also his nephew. Kripi is Kripa's sister, and Kripi was Drona's wife, Ashwatthama's mother. So he feels a familial obligation to sort of morally course correct Ashwatthama, and he begs Ashwatthama not to do this, and that this is not the warrior's way, this is not a Brahmana's way. And he tries to remind him that yes, you are functioning as a Kshatriya right now, but you are a Brahmana, and Brahmana's path is that of peace and not that of a warrior, and you cannot behave in this way. But no matter what they say, Ashwatthama is hell bent on attacking the Pandava court, so he goes away. Now, at this point, one of the things that comes to mind is that yes, Kripa did try to verbally sort of change Ashwatthama's mind, but did he really try enough? Is there a sense of, I would say, resignation or perhaps even cowardice on the part of Kripa and Kritavarma, where they just did not do enough to prevent the massacre that comes ahead? I don't know, but again, it's a very morally grey area, very difficult to sort of visualize what our response would have been. We have to remember that most likely Kripa and Kritavarma have just experienced a massive amount of PTSD, having taken part in an 18-day long massacre where they lost practically everyone in their whole world. So not exactly the best mind space to be making any judgments or trying to influence somebody else's behavior, right? So Ashwatthama decides to make good on his threat, and he actually goes and he sets fire to the Pandava camp while everybody is sleeping. He also starts slaughtering the warriors who are not burnt while they're sleeping. Unluckily for him, but luckily for the Pandavas, Krishna sort of senses that something is going to happen. Therefore, he takes the 5 Pandava brothers and tells them that, it is the victor's obligation to sleep in the defeated army's camp to sort of show that you've taken over their army and their kingdom. So why don't the 6 of us go and sleep in the Kaurava camp for the night, and the others can sleep here. So he conveniently takes the 5 brothers away, and that's what saves their life. But in the massacre, Ashwatthama ends up not only burning most of the, I would say, male soldiers to death, but he also slaughters the Drishtadyumna, Shikhandi, and Draupadi's 5 sons. So I would say Draupadi lost all of her family, with the exception of her husband. Her entire family is now gone. And our 5 Pandavas also do not have any heirs to the throne, because they do not know at this moment that Uttara is carrying Abhimanyu's baby. So they don't know this particular point yet. But for all intents and purposes, they don't have any heirs. And when I say they don't know that Uttara is carrying a child, they don't know that it's a male child. So in their minds, they've officially lost all of their heirs. So even though they've gained the kingdom, it is practically useless because they don't have anyone to hand it over to after their time is done. So it's a massive devastating blow to the Pandavas, and the Pandavas chase down Ashwatthama when they have a when the I would say the terrible encounter between Arjuna and Ashwatthama takes place, because Arjuna is the only one who is capable of actually beating Ashwatthama on any level, because Drona has actually given both of them the same kind of training, rigorous training, because Ashwatthama was his son and Arjuna was his favorite student. So they're the only ones who know all of the tools and all of the weapons that other people actually don't know about. Popular renditions are right in saying that this is, I would say, a very brutal battle, which almost exclusively uses weapons that are magical in nature, divine weapons, a lot of mantras that are used on these weapons to supercharge them. Modern scholars believe that this could have been an indication of nuclear weapons. Some of them, at least. The battle between Arjuna and Ashwatthama is brutal, and finally it comes to the point where they both take out their brahmastras and they aim it at each other, and that is when Vyasa actually steps into the frame and he physically momentarily suspends time, because the brahmastra is a weapon that has the capability of destroying the entire universe, and he doesn't want either of the two warriors to sort of end life as we know it, because the entire universe can collapse onto itself, and that's just from one brahmastra. There are two brahmastras actually coming towards each other. So he asks the warriors, use your austerities to pull the brahmastra back, because you are going to cause untold devastation to the entire universe if this actually comes to fruition, if this actually meets its intended target. Arjuna has the austerities and the spiritual power to pull his weapon back, but that is to recall his weapon. But Ashwatthama, because of the wild deeds that he has committed, again, very interesting to note that it is that with divine weapons, the ability to manage a divine weapon is dependent on your moral aptitude, your moral standing, the following of dharma, rather than your physical capability as a magical being. So it's very, very interesting concept there to actually sort of think about. So because he committed such a heinous act of killing people while they were asleep, he does not have the moral strength to pull back the weapon, and the brahmastra continues to go ahead. And that's when Vyasa says, you know what, you don't have the power to pull it back, but you do have the power to redirect it. So why don't you redirect it at the womb of the Pandavas, so that at least just one unborn child is dead instead of the entire universe? And Ashwatthama agrees, and that's when the brahmastra redirects itself to the womb of Uttara, where baby Parikshit is growing. And it is at this stage, Krishna intervenes and he says, I don't have the power to negate the words of a sage or the power of the Brahmastra, so this will happen. But I can tell you that he's assuring the Pandavas and informing Vyasa and Ashwatthama that the child is going to be dead in Uttara's womb and it's going to be born stillborn, but I will revive it at a later date. So a lot of actually popular retellings tell us that Krishna saves Parikshit from dying, and therefore he's born alive, but that's not the case. It's very clear that Krishna says that the child is going to die in the womb itself, and Uttara will give birth to a dead baby, but that baby can be revived after it comes out of the womb, and that's what Krishna promises. So when this happens, finally, Ashwatthama has sort of exhausted all of his weapons and he doesn't really have anything to sort of fight with. And that's when he very conveniently says, you know what, I give up, you guys win, I'm going to leave. And that's when the Pandavas say, no, you have to give us the money that is on your forehead. So as you know, Ashwatthama wears a jewel on his forehead that protects him and sort of exemplifies his power, strengthens his powers and his prowesses to a greater degree. It's a blessed and divine jewel. And that is what sort of makes him almost undefeatable, you could say. And they say, you give us this jewel because that way we know that you can be defeated, we know that you won't be able to cause as much harm or havoc in the future, so you give this to us. And Ashwatthama just sort of tears the jewel out of his head and he throws it at the Pandavas and he goes away. Now we sort of shift the narrative from the defeat. The Pandavas have technically won against Ashwatthama, but they are a defeated lot because they just found out that their that their sort of future heir, the only singular sole heir that they had banked their hopes upon, would be born, stillborn. And they, even though Krishna sort of tries to convince them that, what, I will bring him back to life, they still don't trust the fact that, dead person can be sort of brought back to life. And because reanimation, of course, I think even in that day and age, even with gods, I think reanimation was a concept that was a little step too far, I think, even for the human mind to imagine. So you can imagine their state of mind when they reached the camp again. Draupadi is heartbroken and crying, and they try to console her by giving her the jewel. And she tells, the only thing I wanted was you to kill him, but you have let him go. So I have to make peace with just his jewel. Fine, I will accept it, but I don't want to hold it. You can give it to Yudhishthira, he'll put it in his crown, as a sign to show the world that we have defeated our enemies. And it's interesting to note that, for me personally, when I was reading this section, throughout the Mahabharata so far till now, Draupadi has very seldom asked for anything. She has very seldom made any demands or comments. And this is one of the first times where she openly sort of goads the Pandavas into particular action, where she basically says, I want you to kill him. Just as he killed my brothers and sons, I want you to torture him and kill him. But then they don't do that, so she sort of like resigns herself to her fate, that, this is my fate. No matter what I ask, it's never going to be exactly as how I want it, so I might as well just make my peace with it. And she sort of keeps quiet after that. So, up until now, we still have all these scenes of war, this lot of violence, physical violence comes into play. But right after this, we have a very tragic set of events that start taking place. First off, we have the conversation between Gandhari and the Pandavas and Krishna, where Gandhari is just heartbroken at the death of her sons. She realizes that, and one really interesting thing about Gandhari is that she knows that her sons sort of called upon their deaths onto their own heads by their actions, by always sort of trying to do some one-upmanship against their cousin. So she realizes this, but she is a grieving mother, so she can't handle the grief that her sons are dead and that her sons' killers are now going to take over her kingdom and enjoy the throne. She is so angry that when Yudhishthira falls at her feet to beg for her mercy, her anger burns and malforms his fingernails and his fingers. And if it had not been for Krishna pulling him away, Yudhishthira would certainly have had his entire hands burned. That is the level of Gandhari's rage. Simultaneously, Dhritarashtra is also heartbroken, but again, it's Dhritarashtra, in true Dhritarashtra fashion, is more concerned about his own sort of safety and his own comfort, where he sort of does I would say 180 degrees and starts begging the Pandavas that, you are my only recourse, you are my only succor, you are my only, I would say, support system. Do not send me away somewhere. You have to take care of me. You have to protect me. Give me space in your home. And he starts basically like Loki begging them to let him continue enjoying the creature comforts of Hastinapura. Not a good look, to be very honest. On the one hand, you have his wife, full of dignity, although a grieving mother and an angry mother, but still full of dignity, ready to just renounce everything and leave because she realizes that her time is done here. On the other hand, you have Dhritarashtra, who is still clinging to these creature comforts. And yes, while he is upset that his sons are dead, to a large extent, he is still very much focused on his own, I would say, his own comforts. After this happens, while this conversation is happening, Gandhari she starts blaming Shakuni, her brother, for leading her sons down this sort of slippery slope that led to their downfall. And then finally she turns her rage towards Krishna and she says that it is through your goading that the Pandavas actually broke all the dharma of war and actually killed her sons through such unfair means. And just as how his intervention and his sort of poking his nose into their business, that's what she says essentially, how her sons had died, Krishna's own family and his own kingdom will collapse and crumble and die a horrific end in the future. and she curses Krishna this way. And as a lot of you know, her curse actually does come true many years later, when Krishna's entire community, the entire Vrishnis and Bhojas and everyone do end up killing themselves, and which also results in the death of Krishna and Balarama later on. But this happens much later. But yes, she does curse Krishna, and Krishna he's unfazed. He doesn't really mind it. He says, I am not exempt to the rules of humanity, just as other people who are cursed must also accept the burden of the curse and must actually live through that experience. I too will have to live through this experience, and I have made my peace with it. One day my community will also have to meet their end. So that's okay. You are just a tool, you're just an instrument. I do not blame you or harbor any ill feelings towards you. And that's when sort of Gandhari lets go of her rage, and then she just bursts into tears, and sort of that is her moment of coming to terms with the reality of the situation. And that is sort of like rising from the ashes as a very sort of calm and sort of like a person with a lot of wisdom and a lot of dignity. You have immense respect for Gandhari at that particular moment. Once all of these conversations are done, so far we have sort of contained the story with the Kshatriyas, with the royal family, and with the fighters themselves. But now the narrative moves towards a larger, I would say, warscape with this Stree Parva, which is, I would say, one of the most heartbreaking chapters in the Mahabharata, especially Mahabharata Volume 8, but overall in the Mahabharata as well, where we witness the grief and the mourning and the desperation of the women and the children of the slain warriors who come to the battlefield in search of the bodies of their loved ones. These are widows, these are mothers, these are orphan children who come desperately cleaving to the hope that their loved ones' remains at least may be found. And the worst part is, most of these remains, they don't remain. Because the chariots and the elephants and the horses kept sort of trampling on the dead bodies, the same ground where the warriors had fallen was used for battle consecutively for 18 days. A lot of the bodies are mangled beyond recognition. They are literally squished to a pulp, muscles mixing, bones breaking, organs splattered, no faces, no skulls. It's a very disturbing description. And if you actually just pause for a moment and think about how these women might be feeling, their family members, their loved ones left so many days ago, and now they come here. They don't even get the closure of performing the funeral rites for them. They don't get the closure of touching their bodies, of seeing their faces for one last time, and doing these funeral rites for them. That is absolutely devastating. One of the things that I remember in Stree Parva is how many of the women, when they realize that their loved ones are gone and they can't even find the bodies, they start scolding Yudhishthira very vehemently, and it's very vitriolic. The women, it's very interesting that they never blame Duryodhana, possibly because he's dead. There is possibly no point in speaking ill of the dead when they can't rectify the issue. You can only direct your rage at the living. And they ask, this man claims himself to be Dharma personified. Is there any Dharma in the way he has treated our family members, the way he has driven them to slaughter? And he does not even have the humility to give us their bodies. And a lot of women start committing sati. They light pyres right there with the wood, and they take the pieces of the chariots and other weapons like the bows and arrows, and they light the kindling right there using whatever they can get, the implements of the war, and then they jump into the fire with their children. And this is absolutely horrific because for those of us who've grown up listening to the Mahabharata, and as we've grown up, we have more nuanced details sort of added to it. This chapter is actually quite horrific and very painful because it reflects a lot of, I would say, challenging patriarchal, oppressive sort of practices that are pushed onto women, where they feel that this is the only course of action that they have. So yeah, it was very, very, I would say, challenging chapter to read. Another thing that I observed in Stree Parva was how a lot of the women in their sort of desperation and in their sadness, in their mourning, they would beat their chairs, they would tear out their hair, they would tear out their clothes, and Gandhari makes this comment saying that they look at them, the way the war has sort of, the consequence of war is that these women have forgotten how to be decent women. They're taking off their clothes and they're crying. They should not be doing that. So it's a very oddly placed comment. Even as I am saying this right now, it sounds so odd. It sounds like slut shaming. Slut shaming women who are just mourning their dead husbands and fathers and brothers and sons, which is so uncalled for. And I don't know why. This kind of feels like this particular section of Gandhara saying these things sort of feels like it must have come from another time, maybe by another writer who added this in, because it is such an uncalled for comment. Basically slut shaming these women who are mourning. I don't like it. Very problematic part. But yes, so the Stree Parva is all about these women's mourning. It's a very short parva. It's not very long, but it is very tragic. Then we move on to the part where the funeral rites are going on for all of the slain warriors from the Kuru and that is the Kaurava and the Pandava armies. Again, this is a very, very short chapter, about just 2 pages long, where you find out a lot about the funeral practices and the customs as well. A lot of these practices and customs are similar to what we practice today, but there are a lot of others that are very unique to that particular time period, or perhaps they are unique to Kshatriyas. I'm not very sure. And then we move on to the Jal Pradhanika Parva, where you basically give water as an offering to the ancestors, to the ones who have departed. And it is at this point that Kunti finally reveals to Yudhishthira that Karna was their brother. And this is sort of, I would say, one of the big blows that comes to Yudhishthira. One was, of course, the actual experience of seeing Bhima bring down Duryodhana. That was a kind of blow to the start of his kingship, that it started on such a I would say, contentious note. But now finding out that Karna was his elder brother, and in the Pandavas' eyes, okay, and especially in Yudhishthira's eyes, you have to remember this one thing, that their whole goal was to get the eldest onto the throne. There was this, I would say, to the point of subservience, there was this loyalty towards the elder brother. And so for Yudhishthira to find out that there was an elder who was, elder to him, and that he did not give this sort of homage, he didn't pay this homage, he didn't show these respects, he didn't give him these honors. And now he feels like this is an ultimate form of betrayal for him. And he's absolutely devastated. And all the brothers spend some time talking about their interactions with Karna, and they just can't believe, and they can't get over the shock that their mother had never revealed the secret to them. And it is at this point that Yudhishthira makes a very, I would say, controversial statement. He passes a very controversial curse when because of what Kunti did, because again he doesn't call her mother, he calls her Kunti. Okay, that should show you his rage towards her. Because Kunti lied to all of us and did not tell us that we had an elder brother, and we killed him in our ignorance. I curse all womankind to never be able to keep a secret. I curse them to be the bearers of gossip. For a man who claims that he is Dharma personified, and what Yudhishthira always, and let me tell you, I have always seen this as a trait in Yudhishthira. He may use different words, but whenever he speaks, he always speaks sort of in a way that portrays himself as the person who is aware, who is so deeply aware and deeply wise about morality and about Dharma. And for someone who claims that over and over again in every interaction, in every conversation, cursing innocent women, innocent bystanders, cursing an entire community, an entire species, just because your mother, for whatever reason, and of course we know that the reason she lied was again because the circumstances that were forced upon her by the patriarchal community from those times. So she had no choice but to sort of keep this a secret. And you're cursing an entire community, an entire group of people? Really? So yeah, all of these, I would say, these really charged, emotionally charged situations bring out a lot of moral dilemmas that also sort of show you what these characters are actually about. Like I said, Yudhishthira claims to be the personification of dharma. Everyone claims that Yudhishthira is the most moral person, most ethical person out there. But Yudhishthira time and time again shows that he is just human and he fails miserably. And a lot of things he does, a lot of things he says are just not ethically right. And I think that's the beauty of the Mahabharata once again, that there is no exemplification of a particular character. People might think that they are the most exemplary example of a particular moral character, but at the end of the day, they're humans, and as humans, they experience these lapses where they err, where they falter, where they fail. Now, after this, again, so this right from Stree Parva to the Jal Pradhanika Parva, to the end of that, it's a very emotionally charged, very sad, I would say, set of parvas. Short parvas compared to most of the others, but extremely sad. I did find myself tearing up sometimes. Once all this is done, we move on to the Raja Dharma Parva, where we start off. So Raja Dharma, again, like, as you may know from the word, is basically the dharma of the Raja, the dharma that is to be followed by kings. And this parva starts out with the crowning of Yudhishthira. So they actually go to Hastinapura, they spend a few days there, the coronation happens, the kingdom is I would say, he starts putting the kingdom together, but he still can't get over the guilt of having killed his brother. He can't get over the guilt of how he won the kingdom. That is how Duryodhana was defeated. So a lot of these things keep weighing on Yudhishthira mentally, although he's actually performing his act of kingship. And that's when all of the elders, Dhaumya, their priest, Krishna, they all suggest to him that why don't you go and have a conversation with Bhishma? Bhishma is still alive, although he's still wounded on the battlefield, he's still alive. And why don't you go and have a conversation with him? Because although now you are the king, and Bhishma has been the regent of sorts, you could say the custodian of the Kuru dynasty, custodian of Hastinapura for decades, for a very, very, very long time, and he's been a part of this lineage for a very long time. I mean, he's been a Kshatriya from a royal household for a very long time. So he's an ancient soul in terms of the kind of wisdom that he can give you. Because once he dies, a whole world of knowledge will die along with him, because it will be lost. Because the amount Bhishma knows, nobody on the earth knows. So you have to go speak to him so that you can collect all of the wisdom that Bhishma has. Like how a bee goes to collect, nectar from a flower. Collect the nectar of knowledge that Bhishma has, and come and make honey out of it in your own kingdom. Apply his ancient wisdom in your own kingdom, in your own practice. And it's very interesting to see that Yudhishthira actually resists this idea vehemently, because he is very, very guilty of meeting Bhishma. And you get this sense of, like a grandchild hesitating to go in front of a grandfather, because he knows that he has committed a mistake, and he knows that the grandfather might not scold him, but the grandfather will know that this grandchild has been up to no good, and will sort of keep that kind of a close eye on him. So, that sort of guilt, that fear of having to meet the elder of the clan, of having to converse with the elder of the clan, especially given the circumstances that he's got the kingdom in, the kind of mind space that he's in right now. So Yudhishthira actually vehemently denies going go and meet Bhishma. But Dhaumya and Krishna and all of the other elders, they urge him, no, just go and talk to him. He will not judge you for what has happened. He will understand that some things are necessary for a transition like this to happen, for a massacre like this to happen. But just go and speak to him. And that is when Yudhishthira finally agrees to go and speak to Bhishma. So this, I would say, brings us to the end of the first part of this review of Volume 8 of the BORI Critical Edition of the Mahabharata. And this was, I would say, about less than 200 pages of this book. A lot has happened, as you can see. But now the second part of the review that I want to actually talk about actually goes right into the heart, the crux of the conversation between Bhishma and Yudhishthira. So this part of the review, and I think this is the point where you will see the way the review goes sort of going to be different from how all of my previous volume 1 to volume 7 review has actually happened. In volume 1 to volume 7, I've been very descriptive in terms of the things that have happened in the book, in the story. I've spoken to you about, we've had discussions about the ethics of a lot of the conversations, a lot of the actions that the characters indulge in. We've sort of really done a deep dive into this, but there is going to be a slight departure, I would say a major departure in the way the review is going to go on for the rest of this book, and also I believe for the entirety of volume 9, and I would say at least half of volume 10, purely because the way the content is. The conversation between Yudhishthira and Bhishma is very complicated. It is very nuanced. It has a lot of philosophical aspects to it. There are a lot of ancient philosophies that are spoken about. There are a lot of ancient stories that are mentioned. And when I say many, hundreds and hundreds of stories within stories within stories. Too many for me to recount in the review and to actually tell you, because all of these stories are so interconnected that if I have to start somewhere, I don't know where to start and where to end, because I'll have to keep telling you multiple things. And I think then this review will probably go on for like 6-7 hours by the time I'm done with the entirety of it. So rather, I thought of sort of focusing on the questions that Yudhishthira asked. So for that, I started making note of all of the questions that Yudhishthira asked Bhishma in this notebook. And this book, the volume 8, actually contains the entirety of the Raja Dharma Parva, the entirety of the Aparta Dharma Parva, and just the first part of the Moksha Dharma Parva. And so the questions that I have written down are the questions that Yudhishthira asks Bhishma, and I've also noted on the page number so that I can go back and I can sort of reference this again. So for example, it sort of looks like this, as you can see here. So I've written out the question, and there's the page number. So it sort of kind of keeps going on. Right, like this, questions with the page number. Sometimes there are answers, sometimes I have observations like this in different color, especially when there are sort of like specific categories of questions that I sort of have. I see a pattern, or I see that there is a certain theme that it's sort of encapsulating. So I've actually made a note of questions, and so far about 142 questions have been asked in volume 8 so far. So I thought I'll just take you through some of the questions, like this is the nature of questions that Yudhishthira asks Bhishma, so that you can get a sense of what actually happens in this section of the book. Because up until I would say the coronation, it's the story that a lot of us are familiar with, but we don't really know, most of us don't really know. I mean, I never knew what the conversation between Yudhishthira and Bhishma entailed until I actually read it for the very first time now. So I'd like to sort of give you a sense of what questions he asked, because even if I can't give you the answers, because like I said, it's 140 questions equivalent to, I would say, like 500 pages in this book. So it's a lot. So I want to just sort of give you a sense of what the questions were. So we'll start off with the Raja Dharma Parva, and the Raja Dharma Parva is the parva that is dedicated to understanding the responsibilities of a king towards his kingdom and towards his people, and it's about the engagement that a king, or I would say a Kshatriya from a royal family, should have, the rules that he should follow, the actions that he should undertake when engaging with the people in his kingdom, when engaging with his enemies, when engaging with his preceptors, when engaging with visitors, and so on. So essentially, all of the questions and all of the answers in this book, in this particular parva, Raj Dharma Parva, are intended to be read, understood, and practiced by kings and kings alone. It is not Praja Dharma. It is not citizen craft. It is not for people like you and me who are not in positions of power. Unless, of course, you are, I don't know, a diplomat or a politician who is the head of a state or head of a country, then possibly this can apply to you. But otherwise, if we are not in that position, then this is not for us. These are things that are especially specifically catered to the actions and behaviors and thoughts of a king, what they should exhibit. Okay, so we start our Raj Dharma Parva with Yudhishthira asking about what is Raja Dharma. First of all, who is a Raja? And what makes a person a Raja compared to other people? Like, for example, where did this sort of, I would say, this practice of kingship and kingdom and leadership actually come from? What does Raj Dharma mean? What makes one person special enough to rule everybody else? What is the defining quality? Is it a supernatural quality? Are they supposed to have magical powers? Is it strategy? Are they supposed to be intelligent? Are they supposed to have a lot of strength? What is that special quality that makes a person eligible to be a Raja and to rule everybody else? And what claim can this person have to demand that other people show him honor and respect? Then there is, so the first set of questions are all about, like I said, the practicalities of kingdom and kingship and kings. Then we sort of move into the three main goals that a king should follow, which is dharma, artha, and kama. So there is a description of how God Brahma. Now I'm sure you can see this picture. There's a red color picture on the wall on the top. That is the photo of God Brahma and Goddess Gayatri from Pushkara that I've just pasted here. One of my relatives went to Pushkara recently, and I asked them to get a photo of the god because I've never seen a Brahma statue before, and I've just placed it here. I know you're not supposed to worship it, but I just wanted to have an image of Brahma in my home because I've never seen God Brahma. So yeah, so God Brahma wrote, I would say, 100,000 chapters. That is 1 lakh chapters, talking about dharma, artha, and kama, and about the rules for how kings should rule their kingdom in order to achieve the goals of dharma, artha, and kama. So there is a short description about those 100,000. That is 1 lakh chapters. Then Yudhishthira asks, okay, now that we're talking about dharma, artha, and kama, let's focus on dharma first. What is the dharma for all the varnas? Not just the varnas, for all the ashramas as well. So the varnas are brahmanas, kshatriyas, vaishyas, and shudras. The ashramas are brahmacharya, grihastha, vanaprastha, and sannyasa. What is the dharma for kings? What is the dharma for citizens? What is the dharma for servants? What practices should a king actually do or indulge in, and what should he not do or not indulge in order to achieve dharma? Right? Then we look at, again, so I'm trying my best to sort of bring in a continuity between these questions, but sometimes these questions might seem sort of like unrelated to each other, so please do bear with me. I'm actually reading it out in the order that is asked in the book. And some cases I had to rephrase it slightly because the questions were sort of mixed with a lot of debates that Yudhishthira and Bhishma were having. So I had to sort of distill the question down into something small. So I've done my best to retain the actual essence of the questions. So yeah. Then he asks, does dharma bring us happiness? And what is happiness? What is auspiciousness? can you achieve happiness and auspicious results without violence? And Yudhishthira, very specifically, he focuses on how he as an individual can be happy. Then he asks, we've spoken about dharma that is to be followed by me and by the people of Hastinapura, but what about the dharma of people from other countries, of non-Sanskrit communities, of tribal people? And he lists a lot of people, like what is the dharma of Yavanas, Kiratas, Chinas, Shabaras, Barbaras, Shakas, Tusharas, Kahavas, Pahlavas, Andhras, Madrakas, Ordas, Pulindas, Ramathas, Kachas, Mlechas, and other mixed caste communities. What is their dharma? And while this answer is not very in depth, because I'm sure this would be a very detailed and very complicated answer, Bhishma just sort of gives a very sort of stock response to some of these questions, because a lot of them, they're sort of outside of the purview of what his conversation or his goal is. And the reason I say this is because a lot of the questions, as you will see going forward, Yudhishthira is very much concerned about his personal, I would say, salvation. Because Yudhishthira still somehow kind of, what the view I walked out with as I read the Raja Dharma Parva about Yudhishthira in particular, is that he is a Kshatriya by birth, but he's a sannyasi at heart, or he perceives himself as a sannyasi at heart. Because irrespective of everything, considering all that people have gone through to get him on the throne, he still doesn't want to be a ruler. And every question that he asks Bhishma, at least initially, at least the first half of the questions, are very much oriented towards, how he can be happy, how he can get salvation, how he can feel peaceful. But they're not specifically about, like, for example, if Rama, Shri Rama, were to ever speak to Bhishma. I know this has nothing to do with each other, but I'm just sort of like hypothesizing here, okay? Just a bit, so stay with me. If Shri Rama had a chance to speak to someone like Bhishma, and if they had a conversation about Raja Dharma, I am 100% sure that Rama's questions would be entirely different than what Yudhishthira has asked him. Because one of the core things that you see about Shri Rama is that he is a king through and through. His focus on the Raja Dharma is so much that everything that he does throughout the Ramayana is sort of colored by his view of Raja Dharma. So I'm very sure that the conversation between Rama and Bhishma would have been entirely different than the conversation between Yudhishthira and Bhishma. So but the interesting thing is Bhishma is aware of Yudhishthira's tendency to sort of go sideways with the conversation. So he's very much aware that the goal of this conversation should be to teach Yudhishthira to share some information that can help him be a better ruler, but be a better king, not to sort of help him, sort of transcend himself or achieve personal goals. It is to help him be a better king. And therefore, when Bhishma answers, he does answer Yudhishthira's questions, even the questions that he asks about his personal salvation, you could say. But he always brings the answer back to how a Raja should behave, to the duties and obligations of a king. And he sort of always kind of like shapes the answer towards what Yudhishthira should know instead of what he actually wants to know. And I think so that's really smart. And mind you, Bhishma is doing this sitting on a bed of arrows. And yes, Krishna says, I'm going to remove your pain from you so you can focus on answering these questions. But can you imagine a really, really old man sleeping on a bed of arrows and taking the time out to talk all these things and sort of navigating also this sort of really petulant behavior by Yudhishthira, who is just refusing to sort of cooperate with him. Right? Okay. The next question that Yudhishthira asks after asking about the dharma of other communities, he asks about how do you deal with bandits when they enter the kingdom? What is the dharma of bandits like? That's a very interesting question to me, because it's very important to understand, if you're dealing with the challenge, you need to understand how that other person or how the challenge actually works. What are the nuances of how they function so that you can craft your response customized to that. So he asks about what is the dharma of bandits and what should you do to kind of sort of work and make sure that the bandits don't harm your kingdom, right? Then once again we come back to his question about the varnas and the ashramas and how the dharma for kshatriyas in various ashramas function. So it's not just Ashramas are the same for, I would say, like there are 4 ashramas for all the varnas. Um, but again, like the ashrama life changes depending on which varna you are. So Grihastha for Brahmana might be different from Grihastha for Kshatriya. Vanaprastha for Vaishya might be different from Vanaprastha for Kshatriya, right? So the difference is there. Okay. Then he speaks about how Brahmanas consider kings to be divinity or god. Kings are considered to be Indra or Vishnu. Why are kings considered to be gods, and whom should you actually worship? Should you worship a real god, or should you worship a king for a community to be happy? Then he asks, about the duties of a king, specifically to the city and to the countryside. How can a king protect people living in different areas, especially if he's not physically present there? How can he make use of spies to keep an eye on his subjects who are living far away? How do you inspire confidence in people from different communities, from different varnas and different ashramas? Especially if you're coming over as a marauding king, taking over a kingdom that was never yours, and trying to establish a new rule, you could say. But of course, in Yudhishthira's case, it wouldn't technically be a new rule completely, because he's still a Kuru prince, right? He's Pandu's son, but he still belongs to the Kuru lineage. So there wouldn't be there wouldn't be a drastic change in terms of how he would rule the kingdom, especially the practices he would follow on, I would say, a large royal scale, because that would still be aligned with the Kuru practices. But still, this is still a new king compared to Dhritarashtra and Duryodhana, right? Then the question is about Dandaniti, that is about Samadhana Bheda Danda. So that is the punishment. What is the science of punishment? How do you practice Dandaniti in a way that is fair and just? Then we look at a set of questions where he asks about where Yudhishthira refers to, I would say, one of the most ancient forms of power struggles that is there in ancient India, which is the power struggle between Brahmanas and Kshatriyas. And he asks, who does the earth really belong to? Who is more superior? Is it a Brahmana or a Kshatriya? Because a Brahmana brings in, I would say, spiritual protection and spiritual services. He's sort of the liaison between God and man. But Kshatriya offers physical protection and physical support, physical comfort, the physical materialistic comfort things, without which people would not have the monetary resources to actually use the services of a Brahmana. So there are a set of questions which focus on who is more superior. Is it a Brahmana? Is it a Kshatriya? Who should actually be the, so as to say, the top dog, the top person in the chain of command? And then he also asks, if a Brahmana abandons a Kshatriya, or if a Kshatriya abandons a Brahmana, who should be revered? Or must they both actually depend on each other for there to be, I would say, a stable society? Right? So essentially, there are a lot of these questions in this part actually focus on the topic of, I would say, religion and state in the act of kingship and governance. So this is very interesting, because a certain set of questions, I would say 5-6 questions, entirely focus on, especially when you consider Bhishma's responses, about whether the governance of a kingdom should be the responsibility of the state itself, of the actually governing body, or should religion also sort of kind of come into the mix and influence decisions of governance. So should they influence each other? Now, that in India we do have a tendency for religion and for culture and for religious organizations and religious leaders to be part of the governing system, to heavily influence the governing system as well. So these set of questions really kind of like distill into that and check whether religion and state, should they interact with each other in terms of governing the kingdom or not. Yeah. After this, we actually focus on if everyone experiences punishment, irrespective of being good or wicked, because then what is the motivation to be good? What is the motivation to not be wicked all the time? Very interesting, sort of comes from the Dandaniti question as well, when basically Bhishma talks of how everyone at some point or the other is punished for something. So Yudhishthira wants to know, if everybody is punished, what is the purpose of Dandaniti? Where is the discernment, and what is the motivation for people to be good? Or how do you know that people will not continuously be bad? Because sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, I'm going to be punished anyway, so I might as well behave however I want, right? Um, then sort of he speaks about Yudhishthira wants to know, because people are being punished, bad things can happen to good people, just like how good things can happen to bad people, right? Why does this happen? Why do bad people sometimes get good rewards even though they're bad? Why do good people get bad circumstances? Why do they find themselves in bad situations, in challenging situations, although they've been good, although they've followed dharma completely? And this sort of brings in the whole thing of karma, and you touch very very lightly upon moksha, but not completely, just a little bit about, again, how the fruits are sort of reaped over lifetimes, how actions affect what we actually get, and so on. Then Yudhishthira wants to know, okay, there are times when brahmanas engage in tasks that they should not engage in. um, so what do you do in such a situation? Again, you will see a lot of these questions Yudhishthira asks in the first set all have to do with Brahmanas, not very much about Kshatriyas. And Bhishma's answers sort of bring the question back towards how Rajas should behave in these circumstances. So this is what I meant when I said, Yudhishthira was born as Kshatriya, but he believes himself to be a Brahmana or a sannyasi at heart. He sort of switches focus from Brahmanas to talking about Vaishyas, what commodities should they sell, what should they not sell, what is considered, I would say, uh, ethical in terms of what kind of businesses Vaishyas can actually engage in. Then he talks about how if the strength and prosperity of a Kshatriya dwindles, how can the king protect his subjects? How can he protect his kingdom? A very important question. Then he asks, okay, because his prosperity is dwindling, his strength is dwindling, if a Kshatriya starts to act injuriously towards others, specifically towards Brahmanas, once again, that's what he's talking about, but it could also be extended to others. If he starts acting injuriously towards others, then who will save the people from this king? Who is supposed to protect them? So the protector becomes the villain in this case. So who will save the citizens from the king and from the injurious acts of the king? So a lot of these questions, once again, they speak about, because we're focusing at Raja Dharma specifically in these few questions, they talk of the nuances of Dharma itself, like nuances of Raj Dharma also, but again, in general, the nuances of Dharma, like how not everything is straightforward, not everything is cut and dry. Then he asks, okay, so if a kingdom falls and if there are a lot of bandits who overrun the kingdom, is the mixing of varnas allowed? And if that is the case, what is the policy that is to be used for the mixing of the varnas? Especially in terms of, can Brahmanas, Vaishyas, and Shudras pick up implements of war? Can they pick up weapons and assist Kshatriyas in protecting the kingdom? Very, very imperative question, I would say, especially in current day, especially with what's happening in, I would say, the whole Ukraine crisis, where a lot of civilians were called upon to take up arms to protect their country. So very important question, I think, very, very timely question, very relevant to this day and age. Then he asks what kind of people should be officiating priests, because these are the priests who sort of also guide the kings, and they sort of act as advisors many times. So what kind of qualities should they have? Then there is a question on how, how kings are expected to conduct sacrifices and offer dakshinas to the priests. But the Vedas do not stipulate how much of dakshina is enough and what kind of sacrifices to do. In this case, how do you know that as a king you have done the sacrifice correctly or with faith, and you have given the right kind of dakshina, and that the priest goes back happy and he does not leave with a bad mindset, and therefore the fruits of the sacrifices are not got because you're not given enough dakshina. Then Yudhishthira asks about how should a king's advisor behave like. Whom should the king trust? Whom should not the king trust? Whom should the king be wary of? Then he talks about, okay, apart from priests and advisors, what about the kith and kin? What about the relatives of the king himself? Which relatives can the king trust? How should the king behave with the relatives that he does not trust? How can you make sure that your relatives that you don't trust don't turn to your enemies and attack you? Super, super important. I mean, This is pretty much Yudhishthira talking about his own personal experience with his cousins, right? He doesn't want a repeat of the situation again. Makes sense. Again, the next question would be about what kind of aids should a king have? Um, what should a king do to ensure that he has moral and ethically incompromisable, incorruptible people in his court? People he can actually trust to advise him and to guide him as he rules the kingdom. Very important, because a lot of the ways in which a king would interact with the kingdom again comes down to his advisors and his priests and his other people who are around him, right? Okay, this is a very important part on the topic of advisors. There is a discussion on the advisory committee that a king should have, and Bhishma actually gives a breakdown of the kind of advisory committee a king should have. So the advisory committee should have 4 Brahmanas, 18 Kshatriyas, 21 Vaishyas, 3 Shudras, and 1 Sutta. And the Sutta should be minimum 50 years of age. So I think it is possibly because he would be a memory keeper, then he would be aware of what happened in the past and sort of like a cautionary agent, you could say. So interesting, you have a representation of everyone. Yes, some people are more than the others, but again, 4 Brahmanas, 18 Kshatriyas, because I think from different categories of Kshatriyas, once again 21 Vaishyas, different industries, 3 Shudras, good representative of people who were expected to be in servitude, and at least on paper they are getting a voice. This looks like a democracy, but again, implementation, whether it's happened in the past or not, I don't know. Then there are a couple of questions about what kind of city should be built, where a king should dwell, how to protect the city, like what kind of embankments to use, moats to use, so these kind of safety implements. If a king is supposed to extend his treasury, how should he behave after he's built a city? How should he impose taxes? How should he regulate industries like alcohol, prostitution, and entertainment? How should he manage Brahmana's greeds? That is a very specific question that he asks. How do I manage Brahmana's greeds and make sure Brahmanas are not going to eat up a lot of the prosperity that is meant for the citizens? And how to manage the 3 main industries that actually bring in prosperity to the kingdom, which is animal husbandry, agriculture, and trade with other countries. Super, very important economic concepts that he discusses with Bhishma. And he asks, because Bhishma talks about how war is also one of the important things that a Kshatriya should actually follow, because a Kshatriya's duty is to expand his kingdom and his prosperity through war and to die on the battlefield. That is the kind of death that a Kshatriya should aspire to have. So Yudhishthira asks, since victory achieved through war is the worst, this is Yudhishthira's belief. If a Kshatriya wishes to defeat another Kshatriya in battle in the victory, how can he follow Dharma? And he gives an example, Yudhishthira gives an example here to sort of counter Bhishma, saying that the ancient texts say that a good king does not prosper through battle but through peace and strategy. That battle should be the last option for a king when nothing else works. And Bhishma agrees with him. I remember this part, but Bhishma agrees with him and says that yes, that is true, which is also why you'll remember in volume 5, before the war even started, a lot of people would actually come to speak to Duryodhana to avoid the war. And they say that, just give them 5 villages, that's enough, and you can keep the rest and just avoid the war. But he refuses. So again, that is actually true. You can actually see this ancient philosophy of trying to solve a problem through strategy and peace instead of war, and only choosing war as the last circumstance. So Yudhishthira is right in asking, but how can a king follow Dharma if he is supposed to battle, and if battling and gaining prosperity through violence and dying on the battlefield is also supposed to be Dharma Kshatriya? So he's actually talking about two conflicting, I would say, expectations of Kshatriya Dharma or Raj Dharma in this case. One is, growing through peace, and the other is growing through violence. Simultaneously, they're actually conflicting dharmas that a Kshatriya is supposed to fulfill. So that's actually super important here. He discusses with Bhishma about how a Kshatriya king should behave when another Raja is advancing against him in battle. What are the rules to follow in war? And these rules, when you actually look at the rules that the way the Mahabharata, the Kurukshetra war actually took place, a lot of these rules were broken. A lot of them were broken. Pretty much none of them were followed at the end. to be very honest. I actually made a note here that how a lot of Yudhishthira's questions about how to be a king is also about how, like I said, about his personal salvation, about how people will view him, and only his morality, his I would say his the fruits that he will attain at the end of his life. It is not, like I said, not very focused on Raja Dharma per se. But again, I sort of also want to kind of talk about here how, and I did mention about how if Rama was talking to Bhishma, the conversation would actually go very differently. But again, I want to actually also stress about the fact that I can sympathize with Yudhishthira, because Rama was raised knowing that he is going to be king one day. So he was raised with the expectation that as a king, as a ruler, as an emperor, he would have to behave in particular ways, and therefore he was sort of primed to receive Raj Dharma advice in a particular way and also act in particular ways. But Yudhishthira was always, he was born in the forest, he was raised in the forest. When they came back, they only stayed for a short period of time to learn their lessons from their preceptors, and then they were again exiled into the forest for ages. So he has not even spent enough time in the kingdom, in the court, let alone being groomed to be a king, to sort of grow with this mindset that I have to be a king, therefore the way I view the world has to be from the lens of a king. So the upbringing of Rama and upbringing of Yudhishthira are wildly different, and therefore both of their reaction, and I would say towards Raja Dharma, towards being the king, are completely different polar opposites as well. So I think if we actually sort of think about it that way, you can extend a lot of grace to Yudhishthira as well. So when he's asking about how to conduct himself against an enemy, and about this, like I mentioned, the contradictory aspect of Kshatriya Dharma, he makes a statement that there is no dharma that is more evil than the dharma of Kshatriya, since they mount campaigns, wage battles, and kill a large number of people. So then he wants to know, how do you fulfill Kshatriya Dharma while also fulfilling your personal dharma of wanting to reach heaven and wanting to get liberated? Very valid question, but also, again, like I mentioned, stems from the fact that Yudhishthira was not primed to be a king, and therefore his focus is still very much self-centered. Then we look at, there are many questions about how people should behave while they are in the army, while they are battling. What signifies an army's victory? If he fails in battle and if he loses his treasury and his army, how should a king behave? And then he asks Bhishma, what are the less than moral ways to defeat an enemy? Which Bhishma does not want to actually sort of tell Yudhishthira, because he feels like this is the kind of wrong dharma that he's actually stating to Yudhishthira. He doesn't want Yudhishthira to follow the morally grey areas of Raja Dharma, because they do exist and we will talk about them a little later. But he doesn't want Yudhishthira to follow those. Then he talks about, again, this is a lot of huge conversations about, how to ensure that the various industries and trade communities can get prosperity. Is there any, and then again, there are questions about dharma itself. There are, what exactly does dharma mean? What are the nuances of dharma? Are there many different branches of dharma? How do you recognize what real dharma is? Then there are questions of truth and falsehood. How should a person who wants to follow dharma act if we are talking about truth and falsehood? What is truth? What is falsehood? Again, very, very philosophical questions. What to do when you utter a lie, when you should speak the truth? What is there a situation where a lie is better than the truth? Like I said, it's a very complicated thing. And then Bhishma makes a statement that is so impactful, and that shows the nature of, or the nuances of how complicated dharma is. And he says that anything that does not cause injury and that which brings prosperity to the doer, that is dharma. So he says that at its core, dharma is anything that does not injure you and that helps you achieve your goal, that brings you prosperity in your personal goal. So that is dharma. So sort of actually shows you that dharma is not society dependent, dharma is not morality dependent, dharma is not based on rules. Dharma is very personal to everybody, and the dharma is unique to each situation and to each person. A lot of questions that sort of go into, once again, like I said, metaphysical, philosophical stuff about the sentiments people experience, about how people can truly be happy and tranquil. This entire section is just too philosophical, and there's just a lot that goes on there. Then he comes back, he switches track again and talks, okay, if after having lost to an enemy, he once again fights and gains back his kingdom, how should he make sure to protect the kingdom and to grow the kingdom? Then there is about, how should a person who is, again, this is not for a king, but how should a person who works in the royal court actually behave in the assembly? How should, and essentially, how should they behave towards the royal members? How should they behave towards their peers? And again, I found this particular section where he asked Bhishma, what should the behavior of the members of the court, that's the employees, the courtiers, be towards the others, towards the supervisors, towards the peers be. I found this section really helpful in terms of advice for all of us employees and subordinates towards our supervisors and our bosses and our managers. A very interesting section. Then they discuss about some royal policy, how to set policies, how a king can delight his subjects, how should a king treat his servants, and how should he hire people. Really important stuff. Then we look at the rod of chastisement. Again, the rod of chastisement is something that Bhishma mentions in connection with Dandaniti. This is essentially, rod of chastisement is not a physical rod. Again, it might have been a physical rod at some point in ancient history, but then now the rod of chastisement is actually, I would say, a theoretical representation of the act of punishing people and the ways of punishing people, and how to basically gain control over the uncontrollable elements or the ones who are causing a lot of problems for the king. It talks about how dharma, artha and kama are connected to each other, and what should a person focus on if they want to achieve all three objectives. What does good conduct actually mean? And then there's a very interesting, again, philosophical discussion about the futility of hope. How Yudhishthira asks, what is the purpose of hope? Doesn't hope harm you more rather than actually helping you, especially in certain situations where the king feels like it's hopeless in terms of managing their kingdom? What does hope do? Does it give you motivation to achieve your goals, or does it actually create more hurdles for you? Then finally he asks, and this is again the last question, Raja Dharma Parva, where Yudhishthira asks, okay, if the king has lost everything, his friends have left him, his supporters have left him, his allies have left him, he's lost his kingdom, he's lost his subjects, he's lost his money, and he's all alone, how does he gain back his kingdom? Is there any way, apart from everything that you mentioned, that a king can follow in order to achieve his goals? And that brings us to the next Parva, which is the Apad Dharma Parva. Now, the Apad Dharma refers to the dharma that is to be followed by kings during situations that are not normal, that are not natural, during challenging situations. And these are extremely challenging situations, taxing situations, where every other aspect of Raja Dharma, if you've actually practiced it, none of them work, and you're at your wit's end, you're pushed to the corner, then these are the underhanded techniques that a king should follow. And Bhishma is very, very very clear, and he says in no uncertain terms that you cannot follow Apad Dharma in a normal course of action, because that is considered wrong and reprehensible. So use it only if you have no other option left. But a good king, a dharmic king, will never follow Apad Dharma. So he wants Yudhishthira that a king following Apad Dharma is actually, I would say, at risk of being censured, at risk of losing his merits, because this is just all the underhanded and illegal, unethical ways of getting back kingdom, getting back prosperity. Should only be followed in the most extreme of situations. Now, this particular Parva, these questions are so specific. Okay. So, for example, a king may be, and I'll just give you an example question. A king may be weak, excessively affectionate towards his relatives, um, but he might suspect respected and important people. He might have made the public lose faith in him. He might have made the advisors be divided in their counsel towards him. During these weaknesses and challenges, he might have to fight a strange enemy. When his senses are thus agitated and he is at his wits' end, what can a king do then? See, very very specific to his interpersonal relationships with his relatives and his advisors and his subjects. Then he sort of talks about the morality of Apada Dharma, specifically with the view of the yugas, like if each yuga dharma is supposed to decay. So then is it okay that if now that we're heading into Kali Yuga, that we can actually practice Apada Dharma more openly? Interesting question. Talks about, are there any situations where dharma becomes adharma and adharma becomes dharma? If every means of sustenance on earth is taken over by bandits during this worst of times, what can a king do to sort of overcome the bandits? If the citizens and advisors are enraged at him and external enemies oppress him, what can a king do? In the midst of an enemy, if he's all alone, how does he defeat them? Very very specific questions. Then as Bhishma is talking about Apada Dharma, there are a lot of and the Apada Dharma section, if you get a chance to read this, please do read it. It's actually quite shocking, a lot of the things that Bhishma tells Yudhishthira. Yudhishthira is extremely appalled by what Bhishma tells him, and he does not want to follow Apada Dharma. And then he almost, like, it comes to the point that where he almost accuses Bhishma of teaching him wrong things. And then Bhishma actually, that's the one time you see Bhishma actually snapping at him and reminding Yudhishthira that dharma is very nuanced and there is no cut and dry, straightforward answer to dharma. That dharma is often confusing, it is conflicting, and he actually mentions, Bhishma mentions that how some so-called virtuous people selectively read, quote, and follow only certain parts of the sacred text that support their arguments while ignoring others. And he tells Yudhishthira, do not become like them. Such a powerful statement. Such a powerful statement. And it is very true. It's very true. Even today, you will see in how religious politics, people quote only certain scriptures that support their views, without reading the entirety, without knowing the overall context. And this is what creates a lot of problems, because they're misguided, misinformed, and they misinform and misguide other people as well. Okay. Then Yudhishthira asks, okay, if a person commits a sin out of an ignorance, how do you recover from it? How do you get freed from the sin? If a person has performed both good deeds and wicked deeds, which deeds are more significant, and what are the fruits that a person reaps, especially if they've done an equal number of good deeds and bad deeds? Then there's a question of what is the true nature of evil, and Bhishma says the foundation of all evil is greed, and there's a huge discussion, a lot of discussion about greed and ignorance. After this conversation about greed and ignorance, there is a very large section on which I found actually particularly problematic, because it contains information such as, how kings can take away anything they want by force from Vaishyas and Shudras as part of Apada Dharma. How people cannot complain about or tattle about Brahmanas even if the Brahmana does something wrong. How mantras are restricted to be used by certain people, and especially women cannot be using them, specifically women, that is young women and maidens. What about old women? I am not sure. What about female sages? I am not sure. They have not mentioned that. About how Brahmanas who marry or have sex with non-Brahmana women should be punished. How there are 5 kinds of lies that can be told that are not a sin, and those lies include lying to women is not a sin, lying to get married is not a sin, lying to make jest is not a sin, lying for preceptors is not a sin, and lying to protect our own life is not a sin. Lying to protect your own life, I can understand, it's understandable, but the others, especially such as lying to women or lying to get married, seems extremely unethical to me per se. Then there's a how if a woman allows herself to be spoiled, okay, quotes I'm saying, be spoiled, then 3/4 of the sin of killing a Brahmana comes onto her, whereas only 1/4 of the sin of killing a Brahmana goes onto the man who has spoiled her. Now, in the cases of abuse and sexual assault, this is such a horrendous thing where then the abuse and the assault and the rape is considered to be woman's prerogative and a woman's responsibility to deal with, and the punishment is supposed to be borne by the woman, which is extremely bad and very horrific and toxic, if you ask me. Punishment for adultery for men and for women, it's given, both is given. Then there's a conversation about the worth of a life of people from different varnas. Now, the worth of a brahmana is 1,000 cows and one bull. Worth of a vaishya is 100 cows and one bull. But worth of a shudra is 10 cows and one bull. And worth of an atreyi woman, that is a woman who is married and who is of reproductive age, if she is killed, then it is 2,000 cows and 2 bulls, because she's supposed to be the progenitor of the line. For Kshatriyas, there is no such thing, because Kshatriya Dharma is to be killed in the battlefield. Speaking of adultery, punishment for wives is much more cruel than punishment for husbands, and specifically in relation to Brahmana wives and Brahmana husbands do not have any punishment at all, even if they commit adultery. Then there are punishments mentioned for younger siblings, especially younger brothers who get married before their older sibling. Then there is a very particularly weird passage on bestiality, that is having sex with animals, and it is mentioned that bestiality is okay if the sex that is had is with an animal who is not a cow, and if the man has not ejaculated. But if he has ejaculated or if he has had sex with a cow, the punishment or atonement for bestiality is that he has to wear animal hide which has hair on it and beg at 7 houses recounting what he did, and he must do this for 12 consecutive days. If he chooses not to wear the animal hide and not tell people what he did, he must beg at houses for 1 whole year. And apparently this is an acceptable thing. I have no comments. Okay, then the conversation shifts from Yudhishthira to Nakula, who has been listening to this, and he asks, the bow is considered to be the most important of all weapons and the most sacred of all weapons, but what about the sword? Because I love to fight with the sword and it's always helped me. So why is the sword not considered the best? And how did the sword originate? So it's a very interesting conversation. And then Yudhishthira has a parallel conversation with his brothers and Vidura, asking them if they could choose what to pursue, dharma, artha and kama, what would it be? Vidura says he would pursue dharma, Bhima says he would pursue kama, Arjuna, Nakula and Sahadeva say they pursue artha, and Yudhishthira says he wants to pursue moksha. And that brings us to the end of the Raja Dharma Parva, and it's a segue into the Moksha Dharma Parva, where the conversation moves from the physical realm to the metaphysical realm. Now, while talking about Moksha Dharma Parva, I do want to say that I personally found it weird that Bhishma chooses to talk about Moksha Dharma with Yudhishthira now. I know it is an important thing for a king to know about, but especially considering Yudhishthira's bent of mind, where, like I said, born as a Kshatriya but considers himself to be a sannyasi, he is literally hopping on one foot to jump ship, to abandon the kingdom and to go into the mountains and renounce life as it is. So Bhishma talking about Moksha Dharma to a man like that is actually very dangerous, if you ask me. Because instead of giving into his, and indulging with his expectations, I would say. Entirety was actually about philosophy, about how the universe is created, about the elements, that is the 5 elements: earth, air, fire, water, and space. About how the human body was created, about how the 5 senses operate. 5 senses of the human body operate. How does the mind operate? What is the difference between knowledge, intelligence, and wisdom? About what are the Mahabhutas, that is, like I said, the elements. How did Brahma create the world? What is the difference between Brahma, Vishnu, and Maheshwara? About yoga, like what exactly is yoga, what exactly is meditation, different yogic practices that help one reach moksha. What is samadhi, what is moksha, what is liberation? How can people varnas renounce? How can mixed varnas renounce? How can then there's also a question, really important question about how varnas are actually decided, and how rules for moksha and how rules for behavior are decided for varnas. And the question is, if the distinction, because Bhishma talks about how each of the varnas has a different color. How Brahmanas are white, Kshatriyas are red, Vaishyas are yellow, and Shudras are black. That's what Bhishma says. And so Yudhishthira asks a very pertinent question. If the distinction between the four varnas is only based on complexion, then are there not more than four varnas, because people with all types of complexions exist in the world, and there are many mixed varnas as well. But what about non-humans who also have different complexions? How do we identify the varna of non-human people, non-human creatures? We also need to consider that there are many common aspects to all people across varnas, such as the feelings of desire, anger, sorrow, happiness, anxiety, hunger, exhaustion, and bodily secretions such as blood, sweat, tears, phlegm, bile, excretion, urine, reproductive juice, etc. How can one definitively say that one person belongs to a specific varna when all these experiences are common to people across varnas? How can one truly determine varnas, and how do you determine actions, course of actions, behavior, thinking, and moksha for all the varnas? Such a powerful question, so pertinent today, and this is the question that I think we must all address when we're talking about casteism in India. Then there's questions of, are varnas dependent on deeds? If yes, how do they work? What are the fruits for various actions? What are the conducts specified for each of the four ashramas? Then there's a question of what is the world beyond this world look like? Is it heaven, or what is the concept of heaven? Then there's a question of, if a person wants to attain samadhi, then how even Swarga can become like a Naraka if he cannot attain samadhi, because that means that if his merits are exhausted from Swarga, he will once again go into the cycle of birth and death. So there's a huge conversation about that. Then there's a conversation about Japamala and Japakas, that is people who do Japa, and the benefits of Japa in Sankhya and Yoga. How a person can be liberated. Then what are the fruits obtained through yoga, through studying, through practicing rituals? What is the difference between all of them? Which is better than the other? That is discussed. Then there's a question of how the Atma, or the Atma in the soul, functions. Where does it come from? Where does it go? How does it transfer from one body to another at the time of death? Why does it transfer? Why can't we see it? Where does it go in the interim, in the sort of the between moments when it does not have a body? Does it remember the previous lives? Does it know what's coming up? So huge questions about Atma. So this entire Moksha Dharma Parva is extremely complicated. It is completely philosophical. A lot of obscure philosophical topics that are spoken about here, and personally, I found this extremely hard. I will be very honest, I did not understand it in its entirety. It was supremely hard, to be very honest. A lot of the conversation in the second half, that is the conversation between Bhishma and Yudhishthira, actually takes on the form of a Panchatantra narrative, with a lot of the stories featuring animals as the protagonists and moral dilemmas discussed from the perspective of the animals. Apada Dharma actually talks about how people misuse the knowledge of the sacred text to commit wrong acts, and then for personal gain, and this does not qualify as true Apada Dharma when they misuse and misrepresent Dharma itself, because even Apada Dharma has certain limits that can be used only in certain sections, certain situations. There is an acknowledgement throughout the book that Dharma has many forms and it is different for everyone. There is not a singular Dharma for everyone or for a specific group. One very, very important observation I want to make is that there are parts of the text that talk about the Brahman and about the Supreme Brahman, about God, about divinity, about deities, and the footnotes in the book mention that the text does not have a gendered pronoun, but the choice has been to use he, him, his, that is male pronouns, has been purely that of the translators, because in English the translation to they, them, their, or to napumsakalinga, basically the genderless entity, does not sound good. But Vivek Devra makes it clear in multiple places that in Sanatana Dharma, when people talk about Brahman or the Supreme God or divinity in general, there is the Supreme Being, that unmanifest being, does not have a gender. The he, him, and his that is used, that is only for the sake of translation. And to me, this actually explains a lot why there's a lot of patriarchal gatekeeping. People misunderstand and think that God in Hinduism, God in Sanatana Dharma, or Brahman and Sanatana Dharma represents a male, but that might actually not be the case. But because of the translation being so faulty and just divert and just sort of going into the he, him, his, the male gender pronoun, for ease of use and for colonial tendencies, I would say, all of our understanding of how the Brahman functions and who the Brahman is also skewed. Then there is my observation about Karma Yoga versus Moksha Dharma. Um, Karma Yoga asks us to put in the effort and then try completely without without setting any specific expectations from the outcome. Do what you can but do not expect, and then just accept what the results come. But Moksha Dharma tells us that liberation is the end game, is the final objective. And because liberation is the final objective, you should not even try, you should not even attempt living at life, just be passive. That's what Moksha Dharma says. And because of this, Moksha Dharma and Karma Yoga, although when you're actually reading it, you sort of like, there are certain sections that seem synonymous, but they're actually not. To me, Karma Yoga is for someone who's in the Brahmacharya or Grihasthra stage, when you have to actively engage with the world, and some parts maybe Vanaprastha. But Moksha Dharma only comes in at the end part of Vanaprastha and in Sannyasa Ashrama. Therefore, there are two very distinct forms of Dharma that need to be followed, distinct forms of yoga that need to be followed, and they are not the same. Okay. So these are the couple of things that I wanted to actually talk about. And one final thing before I end. Where is this one? Yep. It is the book cover that I want to analyze. As you know, I analyze each of the book covers in the books, and this one, as you know, has the face of a horse, or the head of a horse. So I was analyzing the book cover, and the horse head to me represents kingship gained from war, because horse is an implement of war. The horse is also a symbol of a chariot, which is a symbol of a king who goes after dharma, artha, and kama. Horse as a representative of Vishnu in his Hayagriva form, and Hayagriva is considered to be someone who is knowledgeable and who uses wisdom to overcome challenges, and Hayagriva also functions as a kingly figure. And Vishnu is often considered to be the representative of, or rather the kings are considered to be a representative of Vishnu on earth. And once again, so as the horse is a symbol of Raja Dharma, especially in all of these, when we see like the yagnas where the royal horse is let loose, and it shows a sign of kingship. So this shows Yudhishthira's victory and his final arrival at kingship. But again, was the kingship worth it? I don't know, we'll find out. So this brings me to the end of the volume 8 critical edition of the Mahabharata. After this, I will be heading towards volume 9. This is also a huge book, 718 pages. I'm hoping I will finish this in the next few months. I hope I don't take 7 whole months to do it, because I do want to finish reading volume 10 this year as well. Let's see, but I don't know. So I know this video has been super long. If you have stuck with me so far, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time on Tales and Texts. Bye-bye.